Well, on paper it's David Shearer, and it's interesting that he's talking about a new style of politics which doesn't involve what he called gotcha politics, so the sort of the game playing and the sort of I've got to score all the wins type approach. I think that's very noble, I think it's very admirable. Whether he's going to be able to achieve it in an environment where Russell Norman and Winston Peters are equally deluded in their view that they're the real leader of the opposition, that they're the ones with the momentum on their sides, I think is highly debatable. But David Shearer is the leader of the opposition, and his challenge as that person is to now stamp his authority on those disparate forces and to try and wield them into some effective force. If he can do that, then he's got a very strong future. If he can't do that, then he risks just becoming another also-ran. Some people seem to be suggesting that because I'm now the key vote in this, that somehow that changes the whole ball game in terms of what my position and UnitedFuture's position should be. As far as I'm concerned, it's very simple. We gave a commitment pre-election that we would support the energy companies in Air New Zealand with the provisos of certain limits on the level of shareholding. We got an agreement in the confidence and supply agreement that that would happen, so that no more than 49%, no more than 10% to any individual entity, and that would be in the law. And that's what we're honouring. The fact that my vote is now the critical vote doesn't change anything in that respect. For me, it's about integrity. It's about having said, here's what we're going to do, this is what we believe, this is what we are going to do. And if that hangs on my vote, so be it. But I don't accept the argument that says somehow because the numbers have shifted, your vote is now so critical that you've got to shift your pre-announced, pre-agreed, consistent position to accommodate that. Ain't going to be that way, because that's actually a breach of faith. Not entirely clear about the timetable, but I think it's sooner rather than later. I think it's likely to be in the next couple of months, and I think once it's passed, then the issue becomes the timing of any potential sale, whether the full 49% is actually up for sale at any one time, whether all are sold or whether some are sold. And I think really that's a matter that is an issue the Cabinet will decide based on market conditions at the time. But it doesn't automatically follow, in my view, that having passed the legislation in the first half of this year, there's a headlong rush to sale for everything by the end of the year. It's just not going to happen that way. Well, New Zealand is still recovering from the worst impacts of the economic crisis. What we are seeing is revenue is still tracking below the forecasts from the pre-election updates, but about the same time as was forecast this time last year. So I think that we're still in for a long haul change. I don't see any easy recovery, but I do think it's realistic to start to think 3 or 4 years from now of the budget returning to surplus. Ports of Auckland, it's a real throwback, isn't it, to some of the 1970s industrial muscle reaction. I thought we'd moved on from that type of process where it's if we don't get our way, we're on strike. I'm not sure of some of the details of this situation, but it just is an appalling look. And if we're starting to see ships being diverted from our major port elsewhere, that's cutting a wound that's going to be very hard to heal in the short term. Auckland is our major import and export port. Anything that interrupts its operations has got to be detrimental to the economy as a whole. And right at this time, when we're on the brink of coming out of this very big recession, this has got to be daft. So I just think that it's time for cool heads to prevail. I don't get a sense actually from the union perspective, or for that matter from the employers, that there's much of that taking place. But I do think we've got to have competitive, efficient ports, and some of the tactics that I've been hearing of that are being developed by the union just remind me of the worst days of the industrial anarchy we had in the 70s and earlier, and I think New Zealanders are sick and tired of it. The trouble with Waitangi Day is it can never be a credible national day for all New Zealanders while the shenanigans and the protests are part of it. I find it bizarre that people say that we're the only country in the world that allows protest on our national day, as though that's some sort of mark of pride. Our national day is the day we celebrate the instinctive stake we all have in being part of this country, whatever our background or our origin. And my view has always been, if we cannot make Waitangi Day work as that day of national unity and that day of national symbolism, then we need to look to an alternative. And frankly, the events at Waitangi this year were simply one more repetition of all of those things over the years that are leading increasing numbers of people to say, forget the whole thing, I'm just going to the beach. This coming week I'll bring into Parliament the legislation to establish the Game Animal Council, which has had a long history. It was something that UnitedFuture pushed for during the term of the Labour government between 2005 and 2008, when a lot of the background work was done. The work of the Establishment Committee in the last Parliament proposed the model for the Game Animal Council to better manage game resources in New Zealand, and it's going to be my very great privilege this week to introduce the legislation to give effect of that. So it's been a long, tortuous road at times, but we've got there, and I think this will be a very positive step forward, certainly welcomed by many in the hunting and outdoors community right across New Zealand. A little later on in the year, I'll be bringing in legislation to give effect to the confidence and supply agreement provisions regarding the elimination of what's known as heli hunting, or if those in the industry call it, assisted aerial trophy hunting. And that will be according to the terms set out in the confidence and supply agreement, which will ban herding and hazing and the effective use of helicopters as a sort of a shooting platform or a shooting aid for hunters to be able to go in and pick up their trophies. What we're not going to stop, of course, is the right, which is perfectly reasonable, of hunters to be dropped off in locations by a helicopter, but it's the process of the hunt that will be cleared up by the heli hunting legislation. With regard to TVNZ 7, the latest state of play is this. It is still the intention of Television New Zealand to close the service from the end of June this year. However, the alternative that it was planning to replace it with looks to have fallen over. In the meantime, there are various rumblings going on, I gather, within Television New Zealand, and even a little more broadly about whether it made the right call. There's interest being expressed from external quarters. For instance, there's been talk of Maori Television expressing an interest. Now, how that eventuates remains to be seen. And there's a lot of discussion taking place. What is clear is that the audience for Television New Zealand's 7 is much greater than was first thought. Even the most conservative figures have it at just under 500,000 viewers per month. It's likely to be much higher. And the ongoing public campaign for the retention of a public service type broadcasting outlet is continuing. In addition, the removal rather abruptly over the holiday period of the Stratos channel and Triangle Television and that network from air has, if you like, increased the tension for who's going to fill the gap. So while I can't say absolutely right now that there is going to be a solution in place come the end of June, I am quietly optimistic that things are starting to move in a slightly more positive direction than they were even at the end of last year. And I'm certainly keeping up, having discussions with people and keeping up pushing the momentum to try and make sure that this pretty valuable asset is retained in some form for New Zealand viewers to continue to enjoy. Now, just on a very local issue, I'm becoming increasingly aware and concerned about aspects of the review being undertaken by the Greater Wellington Regional Council of bus services in Wellington. On the face of it, it looks like a very rational change to rationalise routes, times and services. But I'm aware that particularly in the northern suburbs, the area that I represent, there are likely to be some quite severe implications for off-peak services, particularly for the people of Churton Park, who may well find their off-peak services reduced, also for people in the Woodridge, Baylands and Paparangi areas. And there's also a risk that in increasing use of hubbing, in other words linking services through to the Johnsonville railhead, we're going to run into some problems of people having to change from bus to train and back and forward and so forth, which I don't think will be very positive. So I'm keeping a close eye on that. I've met with the CEO of the Newlands Bus Company to talk about it, and obviously I'm following some of the public discussion that's taking place. Good news on the transport front though, finally the new Waitangi trains will be on the Johnsonville line from the 19th of March, and that's been a long campaign, And for someone like me, who's been involved in various campaigns to save the Johnsonville lion for nearly 30 years, that's going to be a day to really savour, and I'm looking forward to that immensely. My Erebus op-eds received extraordinary feedback. Most people are very supportive of the call that I've made, but I've had some very bizarre reactions from elderly retired pilots who seem intent to protect the reputations of the Civil Aviation Division and the Chief Inspector of Air Accidents at the time above all else. And whilst their views are historical and interesting timepieces, I don't think they're all that relevant today. On the positive side, I've had some very moving messages from members of the families of the flight crew about what this means to them and how important a sense of closure is to them, and how if we can get an apology recorded for the flight crew or an exoneration of them for what took place, just how much of a relief that's going to be to them. So I'm certainly going to continue with that campaign, because I just think at the end of the day, 32 years later, it's a matter of justice. Oh, the highlight to date has been the visit to Wellington Zoo and being privileged to join the Meerkats for feeding, and to feed the Meerkats and have them crawling all over me, little footprints all over my jacket and trousers, and these cute little animals we've all watched from afar, but to actually have them standing in the palm of your hand was really spectacular. And also just to see the huge change that's going on at Wellington Zoo. And I just say to people, if you haven't been there in a while, get up there and have a look. It's phenomenal transition underway, but it's going to be great even moving on from here in the future. So it's a wonderful asset right in the middle of the city. And if you get a chance to see those meerkats, just say hello to them from me.